Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, 10 years has passed since the Finnish and Tanzanian governments jointly launched the Helsinki Process on Globalization and Democracy. The Helsinki Process was a response to the growing global interdependence, the emergence of new non-state actors in world politics, and a growing number of global challenges that required new sorts of dialogue and cooperation. So in a nutshell, the Helsinki Process sought to contribute to global problem solving by providing a new kind of forum for different stakeholders from the north and south to come together as equals to discuss and develop feasible proposals for addressing common concerns. After a couple of years of intensive work in the Helsinki Group and in the three thematic tracks, we issued in 2005 a joint declaration where we called for an innovative approach to global problem solving that questioned traditional thinking, sought to forge new coalitions for action, and help marshalling the political will and power of governments to bring about far-reaching and transformative change. We sought to establish a broad tent to bring together, encourage and link existing proposals and actors. We hoped to provide a public space in which different stakeholders can work together to create a more equitable and sustainable future. We also wanted this framework to promote new coalitions and mechanisms to provide ideas, innovations and proposals for advancing the global reform agenda and to monitor progress on them. The Helsinki Conference in 2005 launched the second phase of the process, which engaged different stakeholders, friends governments, civil society actors and others to organize a series of roundtables and dialogues which ended up with an extensive list of ideas and proposals on ways forward. The second phase of the process was ended in 2008 by handing over a final report of the Helsinki Process to the UN Secretary General, which focused on the importance of enhancing multi-stakeholder cooperation in global governance and included a number of proposals to promote that within the UN system and elsewhere. The process also led to 6 specific follow-up commitments that took the process forward in a number of specific areas. We shall focus more on the outcome and legacy of the process in our sessions this morning. But at this stage I wish to state the obvious. We did not change the world, and we have not been able to transform the whole system for global governance. And I guess none of us was obsessed with illusionary expectations of that magnitude anyway. But what I think was that we were able to set an example that the multi-stakeholder approach to global problem solving is a useful concept and that it has led to at least some incremental steps forward in improving multilateral cooperation. And this leads us to the obvious follow-up question. What is the purpose of gathering here in Hanasaari today? It is not just to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our cooperation, even if that is a good reason in itself. When our new 6-party Finnish government took office in June last year, it launched a program which includes some high-profile visions and aims regarding global governance and sustainable development. When my colleague Heidi Hautala and myself started to think about ways and means of translating these visions and aims into concrete action, we revisited the Helsinki Process, its legacy and work in philosophy to see what that could offer. And we were also conscious of the fact that many of you had showed an interest in revisiting the Helsinki Process in one way or another. It was clear to us as a starting point that just reactivating the Helsinki process as such from where it was left a couple of years ago is not an option. But we concluded that we would like to sound out whether the legacy and particular working philosophy of the process could be used in dealing with today's global challenges, and whether there would be a broader interest in engaging on that basis. With that in mind, we contacted our Tanzanian colleagues and had a joint meeting in September at the UN in New York, where President Jakaya Kikwete, the first Tanzanian co-chair of the Helsinki process, and the last and present co-chair, Foreign Minister Bernard K. Membe, both attended. Our common conclusion was that, yes, it is definitely worth trying. And as a result, we decided to try to bring together the old network of the Helsinki process and some new partners to have a joint discussion about the present challenges and whether the concept of the Helsinki process still could have something useful to offer in order to take issues forward. We are sincerely pleased that so many of you could make it to this event at quite a short notice. And there are several other colleagues who would have been keen to come but were unable to due to other pressing commitments. We have invited you to this meeting with an open mind, without any clear-cut and pre-prepared package of proposals that we wish you to endorse and start implementing from tomorrow onwards. The program of this conference allows us to spend some time on revisiting the Helsinki process and its legacy, and I also wish to refer to the documentation that you have received regarding the Helsinki process, the brief historical overview of what it was all about, and the information package about the implementation of the 6 commitments of the process. But in addition to this, what we want to do is put the emphasis on the present and on the future. The real crux of the matter is whether we see the need for new openings in the multi-stakeholder spirit of the Helsinki process and what areas and issues that might cover. Minister Hautala and myself will pick up a couple of potential issues of this kind in our introductions to the 2 working sessions of the conference. And we are prepared to consider engaging in new initiatives without forming any new heavy institutional frameworks to do so, but building upon and renewing the networks of contacts that were created during the old Helsinki process. Now I invite my co-chair, Minister Membe, to address the conference.
Your Excellency Erkki Tuomioja, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland, Your Excellency Dr. Asha-Rose Migiro, the Deputy Secretary General, Honorable Ministers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you, Honorable Minister, for the very kind words, for the message that you have just delivered. It's my pleasure to co-chair this session with you again and congratulate you for bouncing back as the Foreign Minister of Finland. When you were absent in the last 4 years, the Helsinki process was doing well, but we missed you so much as one of the co-founders of the Helsinki process. So you are coming back as a foreign minister, and the initiative you took in September to invite all of us, that is the old network of the Helsinki process, together with the friends of the Helsinki process, to come to Finland to review the mechanism, to review what we have done in the past 10 years, is something that we must applaud, and we congratulate you so much for the initiative. Honorable Minister, ladies and gentlemen, addressing problems related to poverty and underdevelopment human rights and democracy, environmental degradation, peace and security, which constitute global governance, were at the core of the objectives and the focus of the Helsinki process. As you have correctly stated, that the as you have correctly stated, that the multi-stakeholder approach was the key and the icon of the Helsinki process. Instead of engaging only governments to resolve issues, the Helsinki process went beyond governments. It brought in stakeholders from all corners, civil societies, the business communities, influential individuals, governments, to speak the least, were all involved in the Helsinki process. This is unique, given the knowledge that we have, that a number of initiatives and the processes in the world have been going either between governments or between civil societies or non-governmental organizations. But ours was a combination that brought together multi-stakeholders to address global issues. Now, 10 years post the Helsinki process, many of these problems, as you have said, continue to persist in different forms and dimensions. Saying so doesn't entail that there isn't any improvement to date. The world has transformed drastically in the past decade, but as you have said, we have not managed to completely transform and change the world. Now, partnership and collaboration at all levels gained momentum. People and the civil societies have been amplified and their role strengthened. Dialogue between governments from north and south has also taken shape, and there is increasing meaningful interaction at all levels. We have failed to record significant strides in these areas of reforming multilateral institutions, broadening policy space, achieving the agreement on climate change, and the reforms of the United Nations Security Council. These are still pending. But today is a very opportune time to take stock of what we have achieved in all these areas, assess the lessons learned, and discuss how the multi-stakeholder approach and the Helsinki process networks will be further strengthened. It is important to chart the way forward on how best we can spread the gospel and contextualize it on our experience in addressing today's complexities. For instance, the need to democratize the debate on the climate change, bridging in civil society and global governance, and making corporate world and the private sector more accountable and responsible stakeholders. Certainly, we need to put to a close the current chapter of increasing dialogue with less actions, i.e. climate change, or more rights with less responsibilities, civil society and the private sector. Greater commitments with compliance deficit in North-South, and a partnership with the hypocrisy of do what I say and not what I do. The contemporary challenges and the ongoing global responses concludes that our decision to start the Helsinki process 10 years ago was and still remains the right thing. And indeed, ahead of time. It makes us friends of the Helsinki process to look at the past with a pride and see the future with greater optimism. We are therefore meeting at the right time to do the right thing. The world today needs valuable contribution of the Helsinki process than it was 10 years ago. We ought to continue to stay the course in searching for new and innovative approaches to global problems. We should continue to take the lead and sustain the momentum. At this point, I wish to thank again Honorable Minister for once again bringing us together here in Helsinki. Tanzania remains faithful and a truthful partner to the Helsinki process. We are proud to be the host of the Institute of African Leadership for Sustainable Development, now called Uongozi Institute in Darussalam, which is a brainchild of this very process. The institute was officially opened on July the 28th in 2010, and it aims at building the capacity of the countries in the region in developing and implementing national policies and the strategies in order to contribute to the development and the sustainability of these countries. I wish to pay glowing tribute to the government of Finland for the role it had played in the establishment of the Institute. I take this opportunity to call upon friends of the Helsinki and the entire network to make full use of this institute to champion the noble work and dedication that collectively we have put in this process. Once again, I would like to thank the government of Finland for the warm reception, generous hospitality, and the excellent facilities which have been extended to all of us since our arrival in this very great and beautiful city of Helsinki. I also wish to thank all stakeholders in the Helsinki process for their tireless efforts and the cooperation over the past 10 years. I look forward to your continued support and the cooperation, and I wish this review conference a very fruitful deliberation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we move forward directly to the first session of the conference with the theme, The Legacy of the Helsinki Process on Globalization and Democracy. And for this theme we have speakers who have been previously involved in the Helsinki process. We are particularly honored to have the UN Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Asha-Rose Migiro, here today, who has been Deputy Secretary General since 2007, and before that the Foreign Minister of Tanzania, and thus the co-chair also of the Helsinki process. After her keynote address, we will hear comments from Mr. Jean-Francois Richard, former World Bank Vice President, and Mr. Kjeld Jakobsen of the Citizens Global Platform, Brazil. And I would like to now invite Ms. Migiro to address the conference. And may I also invite the panelists already to take their seats here behind this table, so we continue with the comments after her presentation. So.
Your Excellency, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland, Erkki Tuomioja, Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Republic of Tanzania, Bernard Membe, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is always wonderful to be back in Finland, and particularly here in Helsinki. But this trip is especially meaningful for me. As you have rightly said, Mr. Minister, I had the honor to co-chair this Helsinki process on globalization and democracy alongside with you. I remember well your positive energy, and I'm delighted to see that you are as enthusiastic as ever, together with your co-chair, Minister Bernard Membe. Traveling over here, I thought about how this Helsinki process was always intended to be inclusive. The idea was to involve, as Minister Membe has said, a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Today, I want to share my ideas on why it is so critical to continue involving these partners, not just for legitimacy, but for results. My focus is on the United Nations, how we are reforming ourselves, how we are advocating for stakeholders in other arenas, and how we are bringing in partners to deliver better for the world's people. Governments, yes, but also intergovernmental organizations, civil society groups, the business community, academia, the media, and concerned individuals. One of the outcomes was the establishment of the Darussalam Institute for Sustainable Development in Tanzania, Uongozi Institute, as Minister Membe has said. This is a strong tool for formulating policies, and it is also a powerful means for raising a generation of young women and men leaders to be true to its name, Uongozi, which is a Swahili word for leadership. At the time, I remember being very encouraged that within the Helsinki process, there was a real emphasis on having a tangible process of multi-stakeholder cooperation linking up with civil society was vital in that regard. Building on such efforts and looking to the future, I believe it is even more important that we prioritize our focus on the role of women and youth and ensure their inclusion in this overall process, particularly with respect to sustainable development. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has repeatedly emphasized this point. Women and youth are central to his action agenda for the next 5 years. He has announced that he will appoint a special representative for youth. Women and youth are helping to drive change around the world. We saw that last year in the peaceful protests that have set the Arab world on an historical path of transformation and empowerment. The cries of dignity, opportunity, and justice are universal. People everywhere want freedom and equality. They are raising their voices partly because they need better living conditions. But they're also speaking out against unfair and unjust systems. We have to respond with fair and just global economic governance. We all know that our world is increasingly interdependent. What may be less obvious is how much this heightened connectedness affects those more vulnerable countries. The volume of international trade is growing. So is the flow of capital across borders, and more people are on the move. These changes are monumental, but our policy response has been minimal. We are simply not keeping pace with events. This is especially true of the shocks that have affected millions of people in recent years, the food, fuel, and financial crisis. Most structures for global economic governance were born more than 60 years ago. Since then, we have many more nation states, and economic power has shifted, in some places dramatically. Europe and the United States in particular are going through difficult times, but many economies in East and South Asia, in Latin America, and even in Africa are growing. Emerging economies can make a major contribution to the world economy. They deserve the opportunity to increase their role in global governance. Ladies and gentlemen, powerful decision-making bodies do not sufficiently reflect the growing impact of developing and emerging markets on the global economy. We have seen some commendable initial steps. The recent reforms at the Bretton Woods institutions are a case in point. Beyond promoting inclusive growth and equality, we have to do more than simply reforming. We need to ensure both greater synergies among as well as participation of all stakeholders. We all need to work together to make our institutions more effective, fair, and accountable. The name of the game is delivering for people. We are striving to provide food, energy, and a social safety net to the poor, but outdated models can slow our progress toward the Millennium Development Goals. The gap between old structures and new realities is causing divisions among groups of countries at different stages of development. We need to strengthen ties among governments, civil society groups, the private sector, and major players on the international scene. The United Nations is doing precisely that through a number of our initiatives. Every woman, every child is promoting global health. Sustainable energy for all is focused on energy security and sustainability. And the United Nations Global Compact has long been a platform for cooperation with partners in the private sector. We are working to address the interlinked challenges of the global economic crisis, environmental degradation, poverty, and social tensions. The Rio Plus 20 Conference on Sustainable Development, taking place in June later this year, will be the next major opportunity to forge a global plan for the future we want. That conference will bring together all the partners we need to achieve collective success. Our meeting here today offers a platform to contribute fresh ideas on how the Rio Plus 20 conference can help usher in the future we want. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the United Nations too must keep pace. Our organization has great legitimacy thanks to its universal nature. But we need greater policy coherence. We need to be more efficient, and we need to move with times. Beyond our own walls, the United Nations works to represent countries that are not included at other fora. For example, at the G20, we bring the concerns of the remaining 173 countries to the table. We are especially focused on making sure that globally policymaking reflects the needs of the world's poor and most vulnerable. The best way to do this is to close the gap between decision makers and the people they answer to, the citizens. That is where multi-stakeholder cooperation comes in. When we engage our partners at all levels of society, we turn resentment into responsibility, and we turn up new ideas for progress. The final report of the Helsinki Process recognizes the enormous potential of this approach, and the report sees the United Nations as a major force in realizing this potential. The United Nations can bring together different players from around the world. We can link them to both formal and informal negotiations on the most important issues of our day. We have decades of experience in helping partners to gather and interact with official government negotiations. From the major conferences of the 1990s to the preparations for Rio Plus 20, the United Nations values contributions with all stakeholders. We are all working towards the same development objectives, and we are exploring the best ways to reach them, including through reforming our own processes where necessary. Dear friends, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has said that, and I quote, "With the right amount of soul-searching, partnership and determination, we can build a United Nations that plays its rightful and necessary role in global economic governance." I look forward to a productive discussion on how we can move together to achieve this objective. As I conclude, I pay tribute once again to the governments of Finland and Tanzania for their leadership and commitment to this process over the past 10 years. I want to thank you very much for your kind attention and wish you very fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
We will now hear the comments first from Mr. Jean-Francois Richard, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be the first commentator. I had the drawback that I didn't see the speech before, so I'm reacting a little bit in my own way. And I decided to do it by looking back at the decade that has gone past us since 2002 when the Helsinki process started. I'll have 3 points. The first one is that for global problem solving, that last decade from 2002 to 2012 has been a lost decade. My second point will be that unfortunately the Helsinki process did not significantly contribute to preventing this lost decade of global problem solving. And my third point, using the fact that the minister said you would have an open mind, I think one should not reactivate the old Helsinki process, but start a new Helsinki process at this point, closely aligned to the original approach of the Helsinki process when it was first launched, because that would make a lot of sense. On the first point, the last decade of global problem solving, the world has become far more dangerous in 2012 than it was in 2002. And that's for 2 reasons. First, the problems that are confronting us are much bigger than they were at that time. And the second reason is that today we are less well equipped to tackle them than we were in 2002. On the first point, the problems becoming bigger, think back to 2002. There was no global financial crisis at the time. On the economic front, the main debate was a polarized debate about economic globalization. and about its drawbacks and the need for democratizing globalization. There were also some specific concerns at the time on Doha and on highly indebted countries, poor countries. On the environmental front, the Kyoto Protocol was still in the process of moving towards ratification, and no one was thinking beyond the 2012 horizon of that protocol. And there was a new problem on the table, that was terrorism. Actually, I remember the minister saying at the time that we were living in the most dangerous times. And when he said this, he was referring to terrorism and the Iraq question. So this was the context in which the process was born. This context came with a frame of reference. That frame of reference was the Millennium Declaration, and especially the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, with that 2015 horizon. Today, in 2012, 10 years later, if we said we were living in the most dangerous of times, we would not merely have in mind terrorism. Indeed, the world has been hit by a financial crisis of incredible violence that almost got us to a meltdown in late 2008, early 2009. And we're now staring at the prospect of a whole series of potential mega crises, which, if we don't deflect them with immense speed, determination, and depth, will reinforce each other into a deadly, unmanageable mess no later than 2040 or 2050, or maybe well before that. So the situation is far more serious than it was in 2002. And whereas at that time there was a frame of reference in the Millennium Declaration, today it feels as if there isn't any frame of reference. Certainly none that reaches to the survival critical 2050 horizon. What mega crises am I talking about? Well, you see them listed all there. The global crisis, the first one, started 5 years ago, still not completely over. It had a first phase which I call the steroid finance crisis. That phase was almost over by 2011. Just think that in the US alone, 25,000 pages of re-regulation are in the works. That crisis took roughly 20 trillion euros to get straightened out. That's when the second phase came in, this very dangerous, badly mishandled Eurozone misdesign crisis. A much smaller, entirely unnecessary crisis that could have been dealt with for 2 trillion euros, much smaller than the previous steroid finance crisis. This global crisis with its two phases so far, it may have a third phase, we'll see that, was unpredictable. Number two, could have easily been avoided. And number three, it will reverse to normal at some point. The problem with the next four crises is that they are just the opposite. They're highly predictable, they're very difficult to deal with, and they may become irreversible if we don't get our act together very soon. The first one of those is the aging and pension, and I would add healthcare explosion crisis, of which we have only seen the tip of the iceberg. This crisis has at the heart of it the fact that the rich countries' population is aging now very rapidly, and from something like 7 workers per retiree, we're now down to 4 workers per retiree, and we're heading for many countries to 2 workers per retiree, and for some countries even less than 2 workers per retiree. Due to this, the public debt of these countries is poised to explode in ways that make the little increase in the debt to GDP ratio caused by the financial crisis of about 40 percentage points look like child stuff. Indeed, the Bank of International Settlements calculations show that under existing policy, the public debt to GDP ratio will go for Japan from 200% today to 600% by 2040. For the US, from 100% today to 450% by 2040. And for most European countries, from 100% today to 350% by 2040. The IMF calculates that the fiscal balance adjustments that you have to make to prevent that explosion of the public debt ratios is of the order of 10 to 15% of GDP, which is a colossal adjustment for most rich countries, about twice as large as painful as what Ireland has been going through recently. At any rate, what these numbers tell us is that the rich countries are about to enter a decades-long period of unending, wrenching fiscal drought. This could actually become phase 3 of the financial crisis. And it would be a very big one that affects not just Europe, but also North America and Japan in a sort of generalized sovereign debt crisis, and certainly fiscal crisis. In terms of size, it's more in the 200 trillion euro league. So much, much bigger than the Eurozone crisis, which is just 2 trillion, and 10 times bigger than the one that had to do with steroid finance. The conventional oil depletion crisis, unfortunately, comes just after that. These dates I gave you are just indicative. It could be plus or minus 5 years. The crisis has to do with the fact that the existing oil fields are aging at the rate of 6 to 7% a year. In other words, their production is going down by that much. Even if you allow for new finds, that fact explains that by 2030 we'll be short 70% of the then demand for conventional petroleum. This is a massive supply deficit which will be plugged, but it will be plugged the expensive way with sort of last drop enhanced recovery, ultra deep drilling under the ice caps, biofuels, coal to gas, coal to liquids, gas to liquids, shale oil, tar sands, things which at that level of that level of deficit at the margin will cost $175 to $250 per barrel, if not more. And I'm not even adding the carbon taxes that may have to come on top of this. What that will mean is a permanent regime change to much higher priced conventional oil, which will have enormous impact on anything that depends on transportation. In other terms, big chunks of the world trade system that depend on low-cost shipping, air travel, tourism, even the way people live in the US in the urban sprawl area where they drive very long distances to work or to church and so forth. This is a huge mega crisis for which we're not prepared at all, like the previous one for which we're also not very well prepared. Then there is the ecological footprint overshoot crisis, about 10, 20 years later. In a nutshell, starting in 85, the ecological footprint of humanity exceeded 1 planet. That we can do for a few years, but we have to come back to 1 planet equivalent, otherwise we're living off the capital instead of living off the interest. Now, instead of doing that, we have been doing just the opposite. We are now at 1.6 planets equivalent. And if you push some numbers for 2050, even assuming very small growth rates from here to there, and heroic increases in resource efficiencies, you still find that we're going to use by then 2.5 planet equivalents, which is absolutely impossible, and which would mean that by then the world's 8 big ecosystems would have started to collapse around 2025, 30, 35. And then comes the climate change crisis at the tail end. And you know about that one, with the disappointing Copenhagen, Cancun, and Durban meetings, the minuscule Kyoto Protocol, which was a mouse of a treaty, is about to run out without a successor arrangement, and all we're left with is a promise by the nation states to enter some sort of agreement of unknown legal force in 2015 that would put binding emissions limitations on all countries starting in 2020, assuming no one changes his mind in between. And then there is a crisis I did not indicate, which would be a sort of poverty and food crisis, particularly food crisis. I have a hard time putting that in time, locating that in time. But clearly, as we have to increase food supplies by 70% by 2050, that will be part of the story. So you get my drift. The problems confronting us in 2012 are much bigger than those that preoccupied us in 2002. And if we don't deflect these mega crises with immense speed, determination, and depth, as I said earlier, it's going to be an unmanageable, potentially fatal mess by 2040 at the latest, or maybe earlier. The question is the existing global problem-solving system capable of that speed, determination, and depth? And that comes to the second sub-point. I think the global problem-solving capacity has gone down in the last 10 years rather than going up. First, because of reasons that one could not have done much about. The first reason is that because of the financial crisis, an attention deficit has arisen. And the nation states are so preoccupied with the financial crisis that they have neglected the other ones that are coming afterwards. And maybe the support system of the global problem-solving system has gone down. The US is torn by a very new kind of belligerent politics. We have a humiliated Europe that is struggling with its Eurozone crisis. A tsunami traumatized Japan. All those supporters have had a harder time propping up the global problem-solving system than they used to. And the emerging new giants have not only not stepped up to the plate, but they may have slowed down some of the urgent problem-solving that was needed over the last 10 years. But there are also reasons why the system has gone down that could have been acted upon over the last 10 years. First, there is a size problem. The UN Center Global Problem Solving is probably too large, with the result that when consensus gets reached, it's all too easily a consensus based on the least interested agreeing with the least committed. This tendency to a low-grade consensus has got worse in the last 10 years. And then one shot we had at remedying this by having a smaller size outfit, the G20, has been rather disappointing. There is a second problem, the paralysis problem, with increasing multipolarity. It seems that the capacity of a few nation states to slow down, debase, or even derail a global agreement in the making seems to have gone up, as we could see in the sad stories of the Doha round and the Kyoto Protocol succession. And there is an agility problem. The capacity of the UN to move the big agendas has gone down over the last 10 years because of its slow, ritualistic, almost 19th century manner in which it operates, compared with the way things can now potentially get done given the new tools at hand. The UN institution has curiously not been able to reinvent itself in that sense, even though the 2002 to 2012 period has been full of examples of new ways of getting things done which could have inspired this reinvention. So the rest of the world became much faster and more agile. The UN system did not. Anyone who doubts my word should read the zero draft of the Rio +20 declaration. You will have tears in your eyes. Fourth, a financial preparedness problem. Since few people have understood the magnitude of the aging and pension explosion crisis, we have failed to prepare the existing governance institutions for the fiscal drought years to come. So in the last decade, while the budgets were still relatively plentiful, we should have made them much more resilient in advance, whereas now we're sending our global institutions into the fiscal drought years unprepared and highly vulnerable to national budget cuts, particularly those UN outfits that depend on annual handouts from the nation states. So there you are. For 10 years, we left global problem solving unsolved and growing, and we have left the already inadequate existing global governance systems become weaker, slower, and more vulnerable. It was really a lost decade. The question is, what was the Helsinki process doing during that 2012 to 2012 period? And that's my second point, is the process, despite its original intention of coming up with creative new approaches to global problem solving, was not able to contribute much to preventing this lost decade. Yeah, I'm almost finished. This had to do with a course change during the 6-year life of the process. The early sentences that you read in the documents said things like, the government of Finland is committed to multi-stakeholder dialogue on necessary changes within the structure of global governance. The aim of the process is to produce over short term concrete ideas that would make worldwide governance structures better. In other terms, global problem solving was to be the main topic of the Helsinki process. Multi-stakeholder dialogue was just the means to the end. It was not the end itself. And indeed, that's how it operated through the Helsinki group and the tracks. But by 2005, 3 years into the process, the original focus on coming up with out-of-the-box ideas on global governance structure had gone, and somehow multi-stakeholder dialogue, which was the means to the end, became the end. It became the target of the process. Indeed, the 2008 report said something like this: unlike the report of 2005, the final report does not aim at making recommendations for reforming existing institutions of global governance. With the Millennium Declarations, the global objectives and policies for tackling them are well in place. The report offers merely experiences and lessons from different kinds of multi-stakeholder initiatives undertaken during the second phase of the process. In other terms, the battleground which the Helsinki process chose for itself was this one. It decided to deal with as major concern, the democratic deficit of globalization. It kept to the Millennium Declaration frame of reference and horizon. It emphasized implementation. The tool was experimental multi-stakeholder dialogue initiatives, and it was at all levels. The agenda that was not used was this one, the battleground that would have been to meet not just the democratic deficit of globalization, but the time deficit of global problem solving, which would have had a 2050 horizon, not the Millennium Declaration, but some vision of what a faster and more effective global problem system should be looking like to be of use to humanity at this critical juncture. A visualization of desirable changes or additions to the existing system. And the tool would have been creativity, brainstorming, and inspiration from other fields, all facilitated, of course, with multi-stakeholder dialogue. And the aim would have been to propose changes to the existing global structures, and it would have been all global. So that brings me to my last point. Clearly, the times are very dire. The issues are huge. Every 10 years that we lose not addressing some of the big issues I had there doubles the cost of mitigating them or solving them. And let's be frank, there's not a chance in the world that today's existing global governance system and the 200 nation states with their short-term and territorial perspectives will take humanity safely through the 2040-2050 straits, unless we come up quickly with new ideas on how to improve the depth, the speed of global problem solving in a major way. And I can see of not many candidates for doing this, but a sort of revived version of the Helsinki process, not like the previous one, a new one, that will use this magical multi-stakeholder dialogue approach to really make a difference in a world that needs a very different change system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now ask Mr. Kjeld Jakobsen to give his comments. He's the active member of the Citizen Global Platform and currently also a consultant for the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas. Please.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank you, Madame Migiro, for your intervention. I fully agree with your concerns about the need of reform of the present international decision-making bodies, because they don't sufficiently, as you said, reflect the reality of today's world. I also appreciated your reference to the reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions and some changes in the composition of their governing bodies as recently achieved. It's important to stress that the new reality of the world and the so-called globalization should not only be about emerging markets, but should also consider the quantity of people represented by the countries who still have less influence on international institutions. And that's my point. The discussion is about people in general, because common people is affected by the decision-making and suffers the consequences when the decisions are wrong. Let's take the example of the IMF. It was important to give emerging countries more power in its governing body. However, If the institution doesn't change its rules, it's not meaningful. And particularly the IMF continues to apply its traditional conditionalities for economic adjustments. So today we are still watching imposition of economic rules on countries, the same conditionalities that us from Brazil and others suffered in the past, to guarantee that big private banks will receive their profits. So ordinary people today are losing jobs and income to guarantee the income of private business. That doesn't make sense, in my opinion. So here we can conclude that international institutions, beyond the influence of national governments, are also influenced by business but not by the people, which is supposed to be the beneficiaries of the decisions. And that's the change that we need in this reform, at least to democratize the decision-making. National institutions, governments, are sometimes distant from their constituents, the people they represent, depending on national rules for the choice of those governments. But certainly the governors of international organizations are much more far away from the people. So we need openness at national levels for the incidence of people on international matters. But we also need democratic space in international institutions, at least for consultations and hearings. I gave the example of economic adjustments by the IMF, but the same also applies to issues like the climate change negotiations that we from the CGP network are dealing with. So how to put people's interest first. So we need new ideas, new visions, and new behaviors. So maybe, and hopefully, the Helsinki process can contribute to that. So thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Ambassador Ilari Rantakari, who will give a report on the final support commitments and their implementation. And Ambassador Rantakari has been involved in the Helsinki process from its very beginning. Please.
Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, my task is just to briefly look back what was committed very concretely in this final report which was submitted in September 2008 to the UN Secretary General. It included, of course, this report, number of things which were done during this process, including, which is not mentioned here, that Finland, together with other partners, greatly tried to, and hopefully we can say succeeded, to get the UN Convention Against Corruption to have a meaningful peer review mechanism, which happened over the years, and that is now existing and started last year. And there are others here who know better, Mr. Vlasis, what has happened with the UNODC in that respect. But these very concrete, by individual organizations or coalitions, were these six commitments in this report. And the first one was this establishing, as it was in the report, the Darussalam Institute for Sustainable Development. But we have heard from the Honorable Minister Membe, as well as the Deputy Secretary General, about what has happened. It was launched and changed, and now it's African Leadership Institute. I think the challenges, I mean, it exists and has already done quite a lot, but I think the challenges are in the how to develop the substantive content as well as how to resource it, which I think we heard also from the minister earlier. The second one was mediating peace in Africa, strengthening the mediation support capacity of the African Union. That was a commitment by Finland and by the Accord, the Crisis Management Initiative, and this has been implemented and it continues. There was a project until 2011, and now there is a new project phase being planned to enhance the capacity of the African Union for peace mediation, especially in Africa. The third commitment, as you recall, there is the Citizens Global Platform, and this civil society platform, and they committed to enhance civil society participation in UN climate change processes. The number 4 commitment was to establish a regional multi-stakeholder forum for West Asia, North Africa. You recall that His Royal Highness Prince Hassan was the member of the Helsinki group, and so he has done a lot to establish this WANA process, as he calls it, and this WANA forum started working as a sort of regional Helsinki process mechanism 2009 and continues. The third forum took place last May. It was about the transition in the region, and the next forum in May will concentrate on the identity issue of the region. We have also here Dr. Ahmad Mango, who has been involved all the time representing His Royal Highness here. Another Middle East, there it is still used, the Middle East Council for Religious Leaders. This commitment was done by the Religions for Peace worldwide through a number of roundtables in Alexandria, and then the religious leaders established 2008 this Middle East Council, which has been acting, and the last council meeting in Marrakesh in November produced quite meaningful commitments. So that continues to work and bring together religious actor for peace in the region. Forum for Dialogue on Developing an Ethics-Based Climate Change Regime. That was the commitment by the Terry Institute in Delhi, and it has concentrated on looking into ethics-based climate change regime, and specifically looked into the 3 substantive issues: the intellectual property rights, adaptation funding, and monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification. As a concluding remarks, very briefly, these were some of them very concrete multi-stakeholder commitments, and my assessment is that actually they have been implemented pretty well and also produced at least, I mean, the dialogue has continued and deepened, and especially in the Middle East region. So I think in that respect, one could conclude that these commitments were not only words, but they have been also implemented. There is still, of course, a long way to go and continue and change maybe the objectives, but I think there is all the reason to thank all those who made those commitments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now we have about half an hour time for questions and comments, not only from the panelists, and you are free to ask for the floor, but also from the floor. It is customary, I believe, in these kind of exercises when we are looking at the review of what has been done and achieved or not, that there are people who will see the glass as being half empty and those who will see it have been half full. But I thank Jean-Francois for his statement, because it reminded us we need to question, do we even have a glass at all? I think this kind of brutal realism is what is very needed and welcome. I just want to say one thing about which I also thought was the important aspect of the Helsinki process, and which has been stated many times, and that is the multi-stakeholder approach. And at the time, I used to say as an example that if we have a huge ambition, it is in this respect, it is to bring together the World Social Forum and World Economic Forum, which were then, and perhaps still are, perceived as the opposite poles of the globalization debate, but which already at the time started to actually engage with each other, and anyway were addressing exactly the same issues, of course in very different settings. But that was an ambition that we had, and I think this ambition for the multi-stakeholder approach should not be forgotten. But I have already some people asking for the floor, so I will give them the floor. And please just introduce yourself, sir. Please, you have the floor first. Yes.
I am Anita Kellesviitanen, and I'm representing here ATTAC Finland and Asia-Europe People's Forum, Finland's chapter. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I would just like to add a few more crisis points, particularly from the civil society point of view. And I noted the ones that Mr. Richard took, and I complement some of them, but I raise also some new ones. And I go very quickly for them. I will not explain because I am sure you understand what I am referring to. First one is the social development crisis. And that, of course, relates to the growing inequalities within the countries, within the regions, and between the countries and regions. The second crisis is the democratic crisis. The streets speaks, as we know. There is a crisis between old democracy and new democracy. There is also a crisis in the parliaments. Some of the parliaments are now what I would call debt bondage, Greece being one. Third is the solidarity crisis. That solidarity between the poor and the rich, but particularly also between the generations. I dislike apocalyptic democracy that always speaks about elderly people as kind of an explosive box of costs. We need to build intergenerational bridges. Fourth is the taxation and public funds crisis. And that, of course, relates to the tax havens, tax evasion, particularly of the private equity firms. Fifth is the productive economy crisis versus financial economy crisis. The financial economy is running after its own tail and does not care to actually make enough investments to the real economy where the jobs are. And finally, the last one, I'm sure there are additional crises also, is the human rights crisis. We need to ask whose rights? Is it the social, economic and cultural rights of the citizens, or is it the rights of the business corporations, who, by the way, also by some mistakes in UN legislation, managed to get human rights to themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. And do you for the floor? No. There at the back, please. Yes. I think there was someone behind you first. Okay? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Wahu Kara. I am Kenyan. I work for an organization called Kenya Debt Relief Network. And I'm glad to be part of this process. My input perhaps is a challenge to all of us. And this is because since Rio, and now we are going Rio plus 20, we've done so many things, including what has already been stated here about the World Social Forum process, which I've been an active member, including hosting the World Social Forum in Africa and in Kenya 2007. And my hope is this, in this process, it is because it has located itself to take a responsibility and a duty to bring all of us here and to audit what has been happening since after the Second World War. And I think after the Second World War, the issue of people was located into states, and states have continued up to where we are, and we know the states are not working because the corporates have taken over the states. So it's only fair we go back to the energy of where people are, and I like the comments of the person from Citizen Global Forum, because at the end of the day, it is the energy of the people that will construct the states that are people-oriented, that are there to serve the interest of life, that are there to bring new visions like we are talking about, new imagination, and new capacity to be able to construct states that are people. So I think the multi-stakeholder dialogue location, it is how do we make the linkages of people to people. And I say this because I work a lot with communities back in Kenya. At the moment we are trying to launch or rather to implement a new constitution. It cannot work because it's being used to re-engineer and to reactivate the old status quo. My warning in this process, let us exit from the box and go for these new ideas and new imagination, which is very located where people are. Because as the world continues to be in all these crises we are talking about, there is also emerging world that remains very strongly on the ground, sustaining life and innovating ways and means and strategies to be able to nurture life and to take care of life. So I think what I am saying, the energy is not at the conferences. The energy is not with governments. The energy is not with corporates. The energy is with people. And where are people? Let us put faces on these people and let us have that voice that is going to bring this new imagination and new visions and new alternatives, so that when we are talking about global governance, it is global governance that links people's ways and aspiration. And that way, we'll be able to come up with new instruments and new institutions that resonate with the issues and the questions of overcoming this greed that kills us. It's greed. And we must locate needs. Thank you.
Bill Vendley here from Religions for Peace. Mine is really just a small comment, but I think it's important and I want to give the process its due. I think we are seeing in this time period that religion is emerging out of the counterterrorism box. And if we looked at the 10-year time frame that was used as in the second intervention, I think this is highly significant. The second point is the interactivity that doesn't come out in the fine report that Ambassador Rantakari gave. Namely, the UN, for example, Madam Under Secretary, as you know, is advancing a very important initiative on mediation. And some of this work is now interacting. The religious mechanisms are now interacting with the new mediation unit. The African Union is looking to, in our case, Religions for Peace, as a collaborator in the issues of conflict resolution. So I would simply signal that the process has been extremely helpful in interactivities between some of the initiatives that were signaled in the report. And I think this is valuable. We've got to go further in this direction. Thank you.
I'm Vijay Pratap. First, I must thank the co-chairs for reconvening the process and hopefully in a new form. But I'm sorry to almost recreate the old debate with Jean-Francois. my attraction to the Helsinki process is that in this all actors matter, including the ordinary mortals, ordinary people. And Jean-Francois was very categorical in sanitizing his whole diagnosis with people, because he mentioned democracy deficit in the passing, and it was not necessary to discuss that. He mentioned poverty in passing, and he mentioned food security issues in passing. It's very frightening, because the crisis, as Marco Ulvila, with the support of your Foreign Ministry research, has pointed out, these are 1 billion polluters, and we all belong to that group of people, and we have the complicity in creating the present crisis. And there was not an iota of introspection about our ignorance, about our self-created uprootedness and the cultural and the knowledge systems refuginess which we have created for these mad class of people, which are 1 billion polluters. Rest of the 5 billion plus are the victims. And there was not even a vaguest hint. I gave this example last time also when we were together. In Andaman Nicobar, when tsunami came, the people on that island were able to anticipate tsunami, and not one soul died, not one physical dead body was there. All of them survived. And look at our science and our meteorology and our climate change science, so just see the difference. So the point I want to emphasize is that we have to introspect, and we have to go to basics, how to create new institutions which will simultaneously be able to pursue the spiritual, the material, the salvation goals of humankind as a whole, and not just class of people. This Greece crisis, if you just force if it is a globalization, and if global family is a family, then if you just take the non-performing assets, what they call, the money plundered by the corporate sector in India will take care of the crisis in Greece. But the package we give is take money from workers, throw them out of the jobs, and we do not talk about the plunder which corporations, and we have no listening space for that. Just read Susan George's book, Bailout for Whom, and the whole analysis will seem topsy-turvy. So I just want to repeat that we must examine our own complicity in the present crisis, and we must start taking people seriously, and we must think that we are also part of the people and part of the problem, and technocrats are almost like, I don't want to elaborate on that. It will be too harsh, so I stop there.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Agnes. I just want to say that I welcome Jean-Francois' brutal realism, and it has shaken us all up. But I do think there have been some developments which he's overlooked. I remember very well discussions in this forum about expanding the G8. It was led, if I'm not mistaken, by the representative from the Brookings Institution, whose name now escapes me. And the fact is, in 2009, the G20 played a problem-solving role in the middle of a financial crisis. So, and before that, we had talked of the G7 mostly, and occasionally the G8. Now, of course, that hasn't been sustained, but nevertheless, there were some glimmers of light there. Secondly, on oil, I think I'm a peak oil advocate. I understand fully the dynamics and what goes on behind the peak oil case. But the fact is the United States believes itself to be self-sufficient in oil by very soon. I'm not sure what the dates are, but it's within a few years, which is why the United States has bailed out of the whole climate change debate and will not fully participate. So we need to re-look at our peak oil thesis, and we need to face the brutal reality that actually there is quite enough oil for the United States to carry on consuming in the way that it's doing. And thirdly, on the public debt and pensioners and all of that, if I were like Mr. Richard and adhered to the IMF's economic policies, I too would feel suicidal. But I know, and we know from bitter experience in the 1930s, that there are alternatives to the economic orthodoxy that the IMF is now inflicting on, for example, Greece, which is absolutely and utterly disastrous. Everyone can see that. We know there are alternatives. And if there are alternatives, we know that at the end of World War II, for example, Britain had 245% of her GDP of public debt as a result of the war. She borrowed to finance the war. And that was unsustainable borrowing. And what did the British government begin to do in 1945? She began to spend. She built houses for her people. She built a new education system. She built the National Health Service. She provided pensions for her people. And what happened to the public debt? It fell like a stone from 245% to 20% of GDP, and it stayed at that for 20 years until Margaret Thatcher came to power and liberalization began to increase the public debt. So, you know, it's not the end of the world, Mr. Jean-Francois, but only if we stop pursuing the crazy orthodox policies of the IMF and the World Bank.
My name is I want to also pick up from where Jean-Francois said. Like him, I'm also a former. He's a former World Bank. I'm a former South Center person. But before I do that, I do want to congratulate the Helsinki process itself, because I think despite challenges, they have succeeded in putting certain concrete, small but concrete measures up front. So I think that they do deserve our support. But I do hope that in the next 2 days, we do face up to the challenges that Jean-Francois put before us. We need to make another roadmap for sure. I have one question for Jean-Francois. Why is it that wisdom comes only after leaving an institutional stranglehold? I mean, you were there for how many years there? What was happening in World Bank that the institutional stranglehold prevented you from saying when you were there? Why now? So perhaps you might want to explain to us what happens to institutions that govern our world. Perhaps you might come to that later on. Thank you.
Jean-Francois and the other panelists will have a chance to respond at the end, but then let's take us to more intervention. Susan, please.
Thank you. I'm Susan George. I'm honorary president of ATTAC France and board chair of the Transnational Institute, and was a member of the Helsinki Process. And I, too, like Yash, want to say that I think this process is, at least for me, and I'm very much involved in civil society and in all sorts of movements, this process is, as far as I know, unique, bringing together representatives of governments, of the United Nations, and people who are on the ground in different ways with social movements, with ecological movements. And I think it's very important to conserve that spirit and to deepen it and to use it, because we've already got the practice now. We don't have to start from zero. So I think that's valuable, and it should be continued insofar as possible. Let me say that it seems clear to me that finance is occupying everybody's attention. Jean-Francois said that. But it's also taking 80% of the investment. 80% of investment goes straight into paper of one kind or another. It doesn't go into the real economy. And this is extremely dangerous. Public spending, all the efforts are now to cut it. Thanks to Anne Pettifor for her spirited defense of Keynesianism, because we know, and we've known since 1880, there's a law called Wagner's Law, which means that it simply, public spending is absolutely correlated with well-being, GNP per inhabitant, and All of the developed countries, you can look at the graphs, and they all go up like this. Public spending, meaning at any level, municipal, regional, or national, they go up like this, and the well-being of the citizens goes up at the same time. And public spending, as I was amazed to learn, is responsible for half the jobs created, including a great many in the private sector by different means. So cutting public spending at this point is a total disaster. Thanks also to Anita Kellas, who has mentioned a whole series of different crises. But I think if I can speak in the brainstorming way that Jean-Francois suggested that we do, how could the Helsinki process, in concert with the government friends, and the UN, help civil society to participate more fully in changing the direction of the world in the way we want it? Because, frankly, civil society very often means 90% business and 10% the rest of us. And business has been very successful in lobbying. In Europe, it is on all of the expert committees. They don't even have a register for lobbying. They can spend whatever they like. In the United States, the finance lobby spent $5 billion getting everything deregulated. That is what partially, but to a good degree, allowed the food crisis, because the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, they always, when they want to change something for the worse, they always call it modernization or reform, but that is what allowed the huge inflow of speculative capital into the derivatives market on food commodities. And this was not entirely, but very largely responsible for the doubling of food prices in 2008, which are now even higher than they were then. So that's just one example of how civil society, meaning business, gets its way. And if the people present here want there to be equilibrium and want there to be a genuine participation of people who are in various struggles on the ground, then I think they've got to be helped to come together. We have had some success in this regard, but mostly civil society people are single-issue people. Because they are not ubiquitous, they have to spend most of their time on an issue. They are either tax justice network people, or they are food people, or health people, or in the faith community, or as ATTAC is in questions of finance, etc., etc. And what we need much more of is the bringing together of those communities so that they can form grand coalitions, because they're all suffering, whether they know it or not, from the same ills, from the same threats. And I think that something like the Helsinki process, with the UN and the friendly countries, could do a great deal of good by helping those different communities, ecological, peace, social justice, inequality, food, health, etc., come together and discuss what are their common concerns, what are the common threats to their constituencies, and help them to elaborate common campaigns, because we know very well that governments don't do things until they're made to do them. So let me just, in closing, cite Franklin Roosevelt, who had a big meeting with the union leaders in 1933, and he said, "Here's my program." And then he said, "Now go out and make me do it." So perhaps we could do something along those lines.
Thank you very much. There are very many requests on the floor, but I have to be a bit brutal at this moment and only recognize two. We will have opportunities later on to continue the discussion with everyone, because I want to give the panelists also a possibility to respond. But I will take two more, one of there and you, please. First, you.
My name is Harsh Banda. I work in India on issues of hunger and homelessness, etc. I just wanted to make three very brief points. Among the the challenges that I see for the Helsinki process, I think the reclaiming of the idea of why states exist, that states primarily exist to defend the rights of poor people and to uphold their rights, to defend, rather than states existing to facilitate markets, because that is really what has changed very, very dramatically, not just the theory but the practice of government. The second is interrogating the questions of economic growth, because the idea that economic growth is the ultimate aspiration means that how much of goods and services we produce is what we should look at. But there are three other questions I think that, paraphrasing from what we learned from Gandhi's economics many years ago, there are three other questions that are at least as important, not how much of goods and services, but what goods and services are we producing? And by what means are we producing them? Are we doing it by means that are exploitative or displacing of labor or polluting the rivers, etc.? And for whom we are doing it, and the whole distribution aspect. And I think we need to, if through this forum we can have new parameters of good governance as well as of looking at economic development in a much more comprehensive way instead of just the numbers of what is produced. And the last is, you were talking about the last 10 years and what has changed. I think that, for me, the biggest change in the world, since 2002, apart from an increasing comfort level with inequalities, is how we are dealing with our diversities. And I think that the global war on terror has led to a re-legitimization of prejudice in the way that we handle communities, particularly the Muslim community, at this point of time. And I think that the handling of our cultural diversities is really one more challenge that I feel that we need to bring in when we have a comprehensive.
Thanks very much. I'm Lawrence MacDonald from the Center for Global Development, and I'm new to the Helsinki Process dialogue, so I want to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to participate. I was very struck by Jean-Francois' comments and the distinction between multi-stakeholder process and problem solving. And it seems to me that the Helsinki process has been very successful in establishing this multi-stakeholder process. And now the question is, what are you going to do with it? And in that way, I would disagree with Jean-Francois in one important regard, and that is I think that the effects of the climate crisis are not something in 2050, but are something today that we're already facing. And in this regard, I want to say that I'm really disappointed in my own country, in the United States, for having been totally captured by the fossil fuel interests, by the coal and oil companies. And I think that one thing that a multi-stakeholder process can do is to think of ways to split the U.S. business coalition. I think we can't have meaningful action on climate unless the United States participates, and we won't have meaningful U.S. participation as long as U.S. policies on this are determined by a business coalition that is led by the fossil fuel companies. I actually think that that coalition can be split relatively easily if there is a forward-looking entity, perhaps Europe, perhaps Brazil, perhaps something that Finland could be catalytic in, which would begin serious discussion of having carbon-based tariffs, border tariffs on exports. And if I think there was a serious proposition on the table to say we are moving to impose tariffs on exports from countries that have not put a price on carbon, that you could split the U.S. coalition and begin to empower those in the United States who would like to see serious action on carbon. Until you can split that business coalition, I'm afraid the United States will not move, and if the United States doesn't move, then I fear we're not going to be able to solve this problem. In that regard, I'm really encouraged by the European airline fuel surtax. I hope that people will push that further. Maybe look at bunker fuel on taxes on shipping fuels, and other ways to begin to use tariffs and taxes to force action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I will give the panelists the opportunity to respond, and I'm sure that Jean-Francois, who has been also have some very direct questions put to him, will respond.
I think it was Anita who gave me a whole list of other crises. I would agree with each one of them. I just didn't have space to put them in. I already spoke too long. Same thing for Vijay. I was not passing over poverty and food crisis. I just so much democracy. I was just saying, I was trying to give the sense of urgency that we should all have in our heads right now. So I'm not passing over these things. I just think they are very important, but the most important thing right now is the time deficit. The democratic deficit is important, but the other one has become very soon.
Understanding deficit.
And there is an understanding deficit, and I would agree with Susan that one thing that would help civil society a lot is to take these single issue civil society entities and give them some sort of systemic framework of how the whole system is interconnected and in jeopardy. I've always noted that when I was at the World Bank, when I would go to NGO conferences, the degree to which they were balkanized, fragmented into many issues, and they didn't have an overall blueprint. And that is sorely missing because it makes it hard for them to create these grand coalitions that would have real impact. When I was at the World Bank, how could I have acquired wisdom only after leaving it? I often had that discussion with Susan. The World Bank was one of the least ideological places you can imagine. We were talking yesterday about a socialist vice president colleague of mine. I wrote my book about all these things when I was at the World Bank criticizing the G7, and I was protected by the World Bank hierarchy in doing that. The World Bank was more like a squabbling faculty. It was not an ideological system with the Washington principles and so forth, consensus principles. I remember when I was in the World Bank always being in wonderment about the picture that was being sent to me of the place I worked in, because I could never recognize it as what it was described as. On peak oil, yes, the US has shale gas, tight gas, but the overall peak oil dynamics are afoot. And those, whether it's 2005, 2010, 2015, we're going to get hit big time by a very large deficit in conventional fuels at a time where a lot of things depend on this. On Anne's point about the UK having a very high debt ratio, public debt ratio after World War II and then spending some more, I agree that there is to some extent a sort of Keynesian reasoning to be held, but the public spending that we're going to talking about looking into the future, who's going to pay for it? The Chinese? In other terms, what we're going through is an enormous adjustment to where the so-called rich countries are in a process that will take them to very high debt levels that are to be financed by the so-called emerging countries or developing countries. There's a limit to how much of that can go on, and you can see that limit already now. With the small Eurozone crisis, you will see it even bigger, looming bigger as we go forward with the pension and old age crisis explosion. So the real question is how much room is there for debt ratios in excess of 100, 120, 150 and so forth. Japan has managed with 200% because a lot of the debt is held by Japanese, but that is an unusual case, and we're going to, in all the rich countries, we're going to be in a situation where the debt ratios are on an absolute explosive track and will have to be reined in. So I wish it was like after the World War II situation. What's also different from World War II, post-World War II situation is that what helps a debt ratio plummet, as you said, Anne, is when the growth rate exceeds the interest rate. After World War II, the growth rates were pretty high. The interest rates were pretty low. Now we have a situation where for an indebted country, the interest rates are very high. Portugal is now paying 11% right now. And the growth in the rich countries that have the debt problem is maybe 2 or 3%. And so it's much harder to have the debt plummet in that sort of scenario than it was after World War II.
Thank you. And the last word will be by the DSG Migiro at this session. Please.
Thank you very much. I think a good number of points have been made, especially in regard to what the world could do, or the international community could do, coming together, not only through governments, but also through a number of interest groups. It could be civil society, it could be the groups that Ms. George has mentioned, and I think all these do have a role. What Mr. Richard was speaking to about the inadequacy of the UN really talks about the decision-making process, which is quite, can be quite frustrating, because it reflects really the complexity of the intergovernmental processes. And it is true that at times, and probably more often than not, interests and priorities of nations come to the fore before the global objectives. But there is need for change, and it is changing, because we do not have any option. And for us, for the United Nations Secretariat, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has tried to go out of the system by really addressing issues like climate change, food crisis, financial crisis, by promoting this multi-stakeholder approach, which is so much at the center of the Helsinki process. Because surely one organization alone cannot do it. But what the United Nations does, and I think we are doing that progressively very well, is to provide this platform where we can bring together all these energies. That we are doing. Can the intergovernmental process really change? Yes. Ms. George has said that governments have to be made to do things, and they have to. And we are seeing now increasingly the involvement of groups outside the government. And the United Nations, what we are doing is really to make sure that we bring them together. We provide the platform. Recently, we just finished a very good event, which was coordinated by our colleagues, Religions for Peace. And this proves really that we can address some of the challenges together. They're talking about peace mediation support, but we are going beyond that. And I think this is where the value of the Helsinki process comes. We have seen incremental but very critical steps that are geared towards addressing world challenges. So I think we really have no option. Business as usual cannot be our option. And given the challenges that have been mentioned here, we really have to use the United Nations as a platform. And we are out there to build partnerships with all those who are we know we can work together to addressing the various issues. So I do think, yes, there are challenges, there are frustrations, but the institutions we have, we have to make them work, we have to reform, and it is not only reform for the purpose of reform, but really putting people at the center. And in this regard, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has outlined a 5-point vision for his next term to ensure that we're working towards a more sustainable, peaceful world with people really being at the center. And people means all of us, including some of the stakeholders who are here. So I would like to stop there in the interest of time, and to hope that in the course of our discussions today and tomorrow, we'll be able to thrash out some of the things that we can take up for action. Thank you.
Thank you, and this brings us to close the first session. I will ask you all to come immediately to the auditorium, which is directly in front, for a family photo. After that, there will be coffee at the premises here, and we will start slightly after 11, not too much after 11, our second session. Thank you very much, and thank you especially the panelists.